My beloved child, stop for a moment, because what you are about to hear is not the kind of story that begins with a simple question and ends with a simple answer. Somewhere in the middle of everything you thought you understood about your special person, there was a conversation you never witnessed, a photograph you never knew had been shown, and a revelation that changed the atmosphere in that room completely. Stay with me. Don't look away now. What comes next changes everything. This is where the story begins. Imagine a quiet room, the kind of room where people lower their voices because they believe secrets become safer when spoken softly. Your photograph is placed on a table. Not a photograph chosen because you looked perfect. Not a photograph selected because someone wanted to admire you. It was shown because someone wanted answers. A third party had questions. Your special person's ex had questions. They wanted to understand why your name kept appearing in conversations, why your presence seemed to remain connected to someone even when nobody openly admitted it, why there was something about you that they could not simply dismiss. They believed that if they could look at your face long enough, if they could ask the right questions, if they could find some hidden explanation for the connection, they would finally understand what was happening. But they were not prepared for what the psychic allegedly noticed when she looked at the photograph. And remember, this is a spiritual storytelling experience, not a claim that a psychic can literally know your destiny. The symbolism matters because sometimes a story reveals something emotionally true long before we know how to explain it logically. Stay with me, because the first thing she noticed was not your name. It was not your relationship status. It was not some obvious detail anyone could have guessed. She reportedly became unusually quiet. The room changed. The people waiting for an answer expected a dramatic statement, perhaps something ordinary, perhaps something they could use to confirm their assumptions about you. Instead, she looked at the photograph again and again. Then she asked a question that nobody expected: who took this picture? That question created confusion. Why would the origin of the photograph matter? Why would the moment captured in that image matter? But the deeper symbolism is powerful. Sometimes people study the picture of a person because they are trying to understand the person without ever taking the time to know their heart. They study expressions. They study appearances. They study what is visible. Yet the person they are trying to understand may have spent years becoming someone far deeper than what can be seen. Your special person's ex thought the photograph would expose you. The third party thought the photograph would explain you. But the story takes an unexpected turn when the very thing they intended to use as evidence against you becomes the symbol that reveals why they could never understand you in the first place. Your answer is closer than you think. Don't skip. Stay till the end. Something huge is waiting for you. The psychic reportedly placed the photograph down, looked at the people in front of her, and said that they were asking the wrong question. They wanted to know what you were doing. She wanted to know what you had survived. They wanted to know whether you could be replaced. She wanted to know why someone had become emotionally affected by your absence. They wanted a label. She described a pattern. And suddenly, the conversation became much more serious. Because according to this fictional spiritual narrative, she sensed that your story was not built around chasing attention. It was built around endurance. You were not the person who needed everyone to understand you. You were the person who learned to keep moving even when nobody understood you. You were not the loudest person in the room. You were not necessarily the person demanding recognition. Yet there was something symbolically represented by your photograph that made the entire situation feel different. The psychic allegedly said, "This person has been underestimated." And that sentence landed differently. Because the people who brought your picture thought they were going to discover your weakness. Instead, they encountered the possibility that your greatest strength had always been the part of you nobody could easily see. Stay with me. There is more. The third party reportedly wanted to know whether you were temporary. The X wanted to know whether you were simply another chapter that would eventually disappear. But the psychic's reaction suggested something completely different in the story. You represented unfinished emotional truth. Not necessarily a guaranteed relationship. Not a promise of a specific outcome. Something more human. Something that explains why certain connections remain in people's minds long after they stop speaking about them. She looked at the photograph again and allegedly said, "There is history around this person that you cannot see." And suddenly nobody was smiling anymore. Because there are people who only know the version of you they were given. They know what someone said about you. They know what they assumed about you. They know what they saw from a distance. But they don't know the nights you had to encourage yourself. They don't know the moments when you had to choose peace instead of explanation. They don't know how many times you wanted to reach out and decided to remain silent. They don't know how often you smiled while carrying questions you could not answer. They don't know how much you changed while everyone else assumed you were standing still. And this is why the photograph becomes so symbolic. A photograph freezes 1 second. It cannot capture the years that created the person standing inside that second. It cannot show the prayers, the disappointments, the lessons, the healing, the patience, the private victories, or the moments when you almost gave up but continued anyway. The people around the table were looking at an image. The story was asking them to look at a person. There is a difference. Don't look away now. What comes next changes everything. The psychic reportedly asked whether your special person had ever tried to act indifferent about you. The room became quiet again. Because the question hit something uncomfortable. Perhaps someone had been pretending that your presence meant nothing. Perhaps someone had been trying to convince others that they had moved on completely. Perhaps the third party had been told that you were irrelevant. Perhaps the X had heard a version of the story designed to make them feel secure. But then the photograph appeared, and suddenly those carefully constructed explanations began to feel incomplete. The psychic reportedly said that your special person's emotional response was more complicated than what had been spoken aloud. Again, this is symbolic storytelling, not a factual prediction. But think about the emotional truth behind it. Sometimes people say they are finished before their heart has finished processing what happened. Sometimes people move forward physically while carrying an unresolved question emotionally. Sometimes they don't miss a person every day, but something random, a song, a place, a photograph, a sentence, brings that person back into their thoughts. And sometimes the person they thought they understood turns out to have been far more significant than they realized. Stay with me. Because the most surprising part was not that the psychic allegedly noticed a connection. It was what she said about you. She reportedly looked at the photograph and described you as someone whose value had been hidden by circumstances. Not hidden because you were weak. Hidden because you had stopped trying to prove yourself. There is a difference between being unseen and being without value. There is a difference between being overlooked and being insignificant. And the story suggests that you may have entered a season where you stopped explaining your worth to people who had already decided not to understand it. That decision changed the energy around you. You became quieter, more selective, more observant. You stopped reacting to every rumor. You stopped chasing every answer. You stopped forcing people to see what they refused to see. And that silence, ironically, became louder than your explanations ever were. Your special person may have noticed it. The third party may have noticed it. The ex may have noticed it. And now, in this story, even the person looking at your photograph seems to notice it. Your answer is closer than you think. Don't skip. Stay with me. The psychic reportedly turned the photograph slightly and asked, "Why does this person look like someone who already knows how the story ends?" Nobody understood what she meant. But perhaps you do. Maybe there is a version of you that has become tired of fighting for outcomes. Maybe you have learned that what belongs in your life should not require you to destroy your peace to keep it there. Maybe you have learned that genuine connection cannot be built entirely on uncertainty. Maybe you have learned that love, friendship, loyalty, and respect become meaningful when they are chosen freely, not demanded repeatedly. The photograph represented that transformation. The person they thought they were investigating was not the same person you had become. And that is the first major twist. They did not discover a secret about you. They discovered that they had misunderstood you. Stay till the end, because the second revelation goes even deeper. The psychic allegedly asked whether you had recently become more distant, more focused, or less interested in proving yourself. The people around her exchanged looks. That detail seemed to strike close to home. She reportedly said that your silence did not represent emptiness. It represented a boundary. And that word changed the entire interpretation. Because when someone is used to your availability, your absence can feel mysterious. When someone is used to your explanations, your silence can feel powerful. When someone is used to knowing how you will react, your calmness can become impossible to predict. And this is where the story becomes emotionally intense. The third party may have expected you to compete. The ex may have expected you to react. Your special person may have expected you to remain emotionally available. But instead, you began choosing yourself. Not out of bitterness. Not out of revenge. Not because you stopped caring. Because you finally understood that caring about someone does not require abandoning yourself. Stay with me. Don't look away now. Something huge is waiting for you. The psychic reportedly said one more sentence that caused the room to go completely still. This person is not who you think they are. And everybody assumed that meant something negative. But then she clarified. She wasn't accusing you of hiding something harmful. She was saying that the version of you they had created in their minds was incomplete. They had placed you inside a small box based on rumors, assumptions, old conversations, and appearances. But you had already grown beyond that box. They were studying an old version of you while life was quietly creating a new one. That is the emotional revelation at the center of this story. You cannot judge someone's destination by an old photograph. You cannot measure someone's heart by a rumor. You cannot define someone's future by their past. And you cannot understand a person simply because you once knew a version of them. People change. People heal. People wake up. People become wiser. People become quieter. People discover their boundaries. People learn to recognize what deserves their energy and what does not. Perhaps that is why the psychic in this story went silent when she looked at your photograph. Not because she had supernatural access to your future, but because the image represented something the people around her had failed to recognize: transformation. Stay with me. The story has not reached the most important moment yet. Because after all the questions, after all the assumptions, after all the speculation about your connection with your special person, the psychic reportedly asked them to put the photograph back on the table. She stared at it for several seconds. Then she allegedly said, "You are looking at this person because you are afraid of what this person means." That sentence changed the room. Suddenly, the conversation was no longer about you. It was about them. Why were they so curious? Why did they need reassurance? Why did your existence create so many questions? Why did your name remain emotionally relevant? Why did a photograph need to be examined at all? Sometimes the person everyone is investigating is not the person carrying the confusion. Sometimes the investigation itself reveals who is uncertain. And that is a powerful twist. The story suggests that your presence became a mirror. Your photograph did not expose you. It reflected their unresolved feelings back toward them. Your calmness reflected their anxiety. Your silence reflected their questions. Your growth reflected their fear of being left behind. Your boundaries reflected their expectation of access. And your ability to continue living without constantly explaining yourself reflected something they could not easily control: your inner freedom. This is where the story begins to move from mystery into revelation. Because the real question is no longer, what did the psychic see? The real question becomes, why were they so desperate to know? Stay with me. Don't skip. Your answer is closer than you think. There is a reason this title found you. Not because a photograph can magically reveal your destiny, and not because someone else's psychic session can dictate your future, but because sometimes a story like this gives language to something you have felt but could not explain. Maybe you have wondered why someone still seems emotionally connected to you while pretending they are not. Maybe you have wondered why a third party seems unusually interested in your life. Maybe you have wondered why someone from the past still appears in conversations. Maybe you have wondered why people who supposedly moved on still seem curious about where you are, what you are doing, and who you have become. This narrative offers one symbolic answer. Because your transformation made the old version of the story impossible to maintain. And when people realize that the person they underestimated has changed, they begin asking questions. What changed? When did it happen? Why didn't we notice? And most importantly, what happens next? Stay till the end. Something huge is waiting for you. The psychic reportedly gave one final look at the photograph before the atmosphere shifted again. She allegedly said that the most important part of your story had not happened yet. And that statement is where this chapter leaves the greatest mystery. Because if the people around the table thought they were investigating your past, what they may have actually stumbled upon was the beginning of your next chapter. The photograph represented who they thought you were. The revelation represented who you had become. But the future represented something nobody in that room could control. Not the third party. Not the ex. Not your special person. Not even the questions that had brought them together. Your future belongs to the choices you make, the boundaries you keep, the healing you continue, and the person you decide to become. So if you have been waiting for someone else to validate your worth, listen carefully. You do not need a psychic, a photograph, an ex, a third party, or even your special person to tell you that your life has meaning. Your value was never created by their attention. And it cannot be destroyed by their misunderstanding. Stay with me. Don't look away now. What comes next changes everything. Because the next part of this story is not about proving that someone secretly wants you. It is about understanding why your presence became impossible to ignore after you stopped trying to be noticed. That is the paradox. When you stopped chasing recognition, you became memorable. When you stopped explaining every decision, people began wondering. When you stopped forcing a connection, the connection became something they had to confront honestly. When you stopped asking, "Do you see me?" you began living as though you already knew who you were. And perhaps that is the revelation the photograph was always meant to symbolize. They were looking at your face, but they were really encountering your transformation. They were searching for weakness, but they found resilience. They were searching for a reason to dismiss you, but they found complexity. They were searching for certainty, but they found a question they could not answer. Who are you now? That is the mystery. Who did you become while they were busy talking about who you used to be? Stay with me. Don't skip. Stay till the end. Because this is only the first layer of the revelation. The photograph was shown because they wanted to understand you. But by the time the conversation ended, according to this fictional spiritual narrative, they were left having to understand themselves. And that is where the real story begins, :